Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. This week, we're going to welcome back Dr. Robert Seelig. I hope you remember him. He was a guest a while back for a two-part series on the Rochambeau Trail. Now, Bob is the chief consultant to the National Park Service for the Rochambeau Trail, and that's the route that marks the way the French commander took his 5,000 troops from Rhode Island to Virginia to face off against the British with the Patriots in the Battle of Yorktown. And that's the one that brought America finally its freedom in the Revolutionary War. What you may not know is that 600 of Rochambeau's troops were in a separate special fighting unit called Lauzon's Legion. Well, they kind of broke the traditional mold of the French army and spent a highly interesting and unusual, to say the least, winter in Lebanon, Connecticut back in 1780 to 81. Well, you're going to hear all about it in a moment. This week's trivia question: what major event happened in Waterbury, Connecticut in early February 1902? We're going to have the answer for you after the program, and that's when we'll tell you what's coming up on next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. Yale New Haven Hospital was the very first hospital in Connecticut. They opened their doors 200 years ago and later introduced the entire country to the use of penicillin and chemotherapy. Today, some of the brightest minds in medicine choose to work there, and it's the primary teaching hospital for the prestigious Yale School of Medicine. For more information, log on to ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. America's battle for independence from England, better known as the Revolutionary War, lasted 8 years. That started in 1775, the shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord that you've all heard about, all the way to the signing of the Paris Peace Treaty in 1783. Now, along that way, many times, it almost didn't happen. General George Washington was at the end of his rope. His troops were in disarray many times. And in fact, it got to the spring of 1781, and he wrote very famously, "We are near the end of our tether." Now, the reason why we regard Washington so highly is that despite all this, he never gave up, and he fought to the end, and we won our independence. But not without some help from the French. And what he was saying when he said we're at the end of our tether was that if the French don't help us, the cause of independence will frankly be doomed. Well, fortunately, the French were on their way. In fact, they had already landed in the United States, a force of fighters. That's because King Louis XVI in France had sent them because he wanted revenge against the British. He despised the British. They had been fighting for years. In fact, they had just finished a 7-year war in Europe. We called it the French and Indian War in North America. And the French lost. Therefore, they had to give up Canada to the British, amongst other things. Well, Louis XVI wanted revenge, and he saw the American Revolution as a great opportunity to extract that revenge. And so he sent some troops over, and it was just in time. Now, as the old saying goes, politics makes strange bedfellows, and the Americans weren't used to fighting with the French. They were used to fighting against the French, because that's what happened in the French and Indian War back when Americans were still British subjects. Well, it was 5 years into the war when the French finally sent their troops over, but it was a goodly amount. 5,000 soldiers came over on 32 boats, and they landed in Newport, Rhode Island. They would stay there in 1780, through the winter into 1781, and then make a 600-mile march from Rhode Island all the way down to Virginia to fight the decisive Battle of Yorktown, where American independence was won. Well, the full story of this escapade oftentimes overlooks one very interesting component, and it's namely a segment of Rochambeau's force known as Lauzon's Legion. And Lauzon's Legion had a large contingent of hussar fighters. Hussars were mainly Hungarian. They were highly decorated, very brave. However, the word hussar means someone who steals and robs. And this reputation not only preceded them in the States, but it kind of hung around after they left as well. Well, our guest today, Dr. Robert Selig, is the foremost expert on Rochambeau's troops and the path he took to help the Americans ultimately win the war. He's written a book, Hussars in Lebanon, which chronicles Lauzon's Legion and especially the interesting winter of 1780 to 81 in Lebanon, Connecticut, a tiny town in the eastern portion of the state where the Hussars would stay with all their horses. It was going to be a difficult winter with a lot of misunderstandings, outright pillaging, and some challenging encounters. The leader of the group himself, Lauzon, was a bit of a playboy. It's said of him, and I quote, "He yearned to add the honors of war to the laurels earned in the bedrooms of Versailles." Well, he was from French nobility, so when he stood up and said, look, I want to be in the military campaign in the U.S., he got to go. But the unit that was under him was put together very quickly. It was a hodgepodge of recycled soldiers from other battles, as well as many fighters from countries where German was the primary language.
Since they are mostly from German-speaking principalities, the language of command is German, and that is something that will be pointed out repeatedly while they are here in the United States then.
There's a lot of examples in your book about how they are not necessarily treated differently than Rochambeau's troops, but they are certainly paid less. They keep separate from Rochambeau's main troops when they're in the United States. They're, of course, providing flanking services. But in many, many ways, even when they first got to Rhode Island, they were not quartered in the same location. So there was this sort of separate nature, at least I get the sense of it from reading your book, that may have led to some division maybe between the two. Either they're commanded in German. What were the problems that came up from that kind of situation?
Yes, Lauzon's Legion, for a number of reasons, is somewhat kept separate from Rochambeau's main forces in Rhode Island, for example. Since they are on horseback, they do what they're supposed to be doing: reconnaissance in the countryside, looking out for loyalists, things like that, while the infantry that is in and around Newport is throwing up earthworks, defensive works, etc. The problem there is that the infantry gets paid separately for this work that's not part of their job description. And pretty soon the hussars start to complain, saying, hey, these folks over there, they're making extra money while we are riding around and we're missing out on opportunities. That's one of the issues that rises very quickly. The other is that this unit, lacks esprit de corps. It is so young, it's thrown together, people from different backgrounds, anybody who shows up or volunteers to join there is taken because there's no time for a thorough selection process. And there are some people in there who have problems defining the difference between mine and yours. And that even includes some of the officers. So one of the reasons why they are kept separate is because some of these soldiers are presenting a bad example toward the rest of Rochambeau's troops. Another is the fact that the hussars, for example, have hundreds of horses. They need different supplies, so you put them in a different location if possible.
The space that one horse would take up on a boat was equivalent to what 10 men would need on that same boat, not to mention the gallons, thousands of gallons of water that would be needed to accompany that kind of cargo, meaning horses.
To the best of my knowledge, not a single horse made it across. Even Rochambeau left his horses back in France. Since you're bringing up horses, that causes a number of problems over here as well. General Heath, for example, writes to Washington from Newport that he had supplied Rochambeau with American drivers for the artillery and the ammunition wagons because, and I quote General Heath, he says, it would be impossible for the Frenchmen to drive the American horses without creating the greatest confusion and disorder, especially in action. And that is because it turns out the American horses don't understand French language commands, and no self-respecting Yankee horse will obey a command if it's given in French.
The other issue that came up, the sheer cost of outfitting things, and frankly, what I would lay down is perhaps the greed of some of the residents of Rhode Island and later Connecticut in terms of supplying these French troops who had come to help us beat the British, and yet were charging exorbitant amounts for the supplies.
Newport in particular, but Connecticut as a whole, had certainly suffered during this War of Independence already for years, both on the state as well as on the federal level. People had gotten paid with IOUs, with certificates, or with more increasingly worthless paper money. And now there come the French here with barrels of silver and gold, and they're paying in cash. Of all the 13 states that declare their independence, Connecticut is the most densely populated state with a declining standard of living. And here suddenly are people with silver, with gold, who seem to pay whatever is being charged. The idea of a market-based economy, you charge whatever the market will bear, is something that is totally alien to the French officers that are over here. Not only can they not just requisition horses and cattle and wagons the way they are used to do this in Europe, they have to pay for it. And when they first come, they have no idea how much, what's the going rate here, what's the going price, and they're being taken advantage of. This will, of course, then lead to problems all along the way. The French saying, well, we're being overcharged, even though they don't even know very often what the going rate was or is at this point. They don't plan ahead what they need. They just come in the morning, says, we need horses. If you tell me the night before, I can go around and negotiate. But as the French are learning about this market-based economy, then the goose that lays the golden eggs doesn't do that anymore. Then they start negotiating, and then they are in a better position because they do have the cash, they have the gold and silver, and that then leads to tensions. And it takes a couple months for an equilibrium to develop.
Lausanne volunteers, as we would maybe call them, made 1/3 the pay of Rochambeau's regular troops. And it could be the case that if they were to buy, for example, just to put this in perspective, to eat a whole meal, could consume, a month's worth of income if they were to go to a Lebanon tavern or inn for a weekend. It's just there was not a lot of money to go around. And as you started to say, this led to difficulties as well, including pillaging.
Part of the social wages that the soldiers are getting is their food, clothing, etc. I mean, they have deductions from their salary from that. But no, that doesn't include the extra bottle of rum at a tavern. That has to come out of their pay. And of course, what also plays into this is that once Lauzon's Legion, the Hussars, are in Lebanon, which was quite remote, the officers from Lauzon on down very quickly leave town. Not only because Lebanon, with all due respect, does not compare to Versailles or Paris, but also because they do want to see some of the country that they're in. They want to travel. As these officers leave, discipline is loosened. And we all know that when the cat's out of the house, the mice will be dancing on the table. And that also goes into the complaints that we get about pillaging and stealing of chickens, etc., that we get in Lebanon.
Why did they leave Newport to go to rural Connecticut?
The simple answer to that is cost. These hussars and these hundreds of horses need to be stabled at the cheapest possible location. Lebanon was not the first choice. Rochambeau would have preferred to have them in Providence, just up the road from Newport. because they would be closer in case he would need them. But the folks in Providence said, no, thank you. And then Governor Trumbull suggested that they come to Lebanon, and this is where they end up, in part because they wanted to support the war effort, and in part, I'm sure, because by November of 1781, they all had learned that the French pay in gold and silver, and a couple of hundred soldiers there with hundreds of horses would also bring cash into the community. For much of the War of Independence, Lebanon is the de facto capital of Connecticut. I mean, Governor Trumbull is there. There's the War Office there, where more than half of the meetings of the government, basically, of Connecticut. Lebanon is much more important than the outer appearance if you go there now. Yes, it's not Versailles, but for the continuance of the war and the important role that Connecticut plays, Lebanon is a pivotal point in the wheel. Whenever Washington desperately needs supplies, needs cattle, whatever, his go-to person is Governor Trumbull of Connecticut.
Now let's talk about what happened when they got to Lebanon. They got there, and of course, there were no huts waiting for them to sleep in as winter is rapidly approaching. In fact, I think they arrived on November 11th, and November 13th was the first snow of the season. What did they have to put together in terms of housing, and how quickly did they have to do it?
As you said, if 2 days after their arrival it started to snow in Lebanon, they had to put up their huts and barracks as quickly as possible. And they did. Trees and woods and planks, etc., were available and could be produced, and the huts were put up very quickly. But of course, that's not all what you need for these, some 250 or so men in Lebanon. You need a place to butcher. You need a guardhouse, unfortunately, also. There's a whole network of resources, of huts, of houses, and things like that that you need as you create almost a little village. And of course, the officers will not be sleeping in these drafty barracks. You need to find housing and lodging for them as well. And so they are located in the homes of the citizens.
Now, as you noted, they built these rather drafty places. They also built that, but I also want to go back to the bake shop, which was interesting because they're French, they love bread, and this was a relatively inexpensive way for them to make and consume their bread.
That is correct. They have a bakehouse. However, if you've ever been to France, you know that a French baguette and some bread baked from cornmeal is not the same thing. We know that Christian de Pont, for example, from letters to his mother, that she sent him fine wheat flour from France. To us, it seems incredible that somebody would send flour, but they just are used to different quality foodstuffs than what they feel is available on the edges of civilization, basically, which is what these nascent United States really are compared to Europe.
You make an interesting point in the book, which is that the negative stories tend to last longer and be more prominent than the positive ones. And yet there was a lot of positive that came out of this. One of the stories that's told is when the meeting was going to occur between Rochambeau and Washington. They were riding to the meeting, and a wagon wheel broke in the town or village, I guess at that time, of Scotland. And at first, the gentleman who repairs the wheels was not going to come out, said he was sick. He doesn't do middle of the night repairs. But as soon as he found out who it was that had broken down, came out within the hour. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is accurate. With this blacksmith fixing the wheel, we know that people name their sons or their children after French officers because the Americans know that they are at the end of their tether. The Americans know that they need the French as the French money that the Continental Army is getting smaller and smaller. They know how critical that aid is. At the same time, of course, talking about getting used to the French and Indian War had only been over in 1763. That's not that long. Many of the people living in Connecticut, the men certainly, had fought in this French and Indian War. Anti-Catholicism, anti-French is something that they grow up with. Washington has to prohibit the celebration of Guy Fawkes Day, where effigies of the Pope are burned in Boston and in New England. And New Englanders had never seen a Frenchman other than on the other end of their musket barrel as an enemy. So it takes a long time and personal contacts for these preconceived notions to be corrected by reality.
Well, Governor Trumbull's own daughter wrote a letter in which she expressed happiness, in fact glee, that the Hussars had finally vacated her town of Lebanon. Now, Luzon and his troops marched a separate route from Rochambeau across Connecticut. They provided a bit of a buffer between Long Island Sound, where the British had all their ships and a very strong navy, and inland, where Rochambeau's men were marching. And this way, if there was an ambush or something like that, they wouldn't wipe out the entire French force. Well, there's no known map showing exactly where the Luzon's legion went, and yet they met up as planned in western Connecticut. The Hussars would go on to serve and fight with distinction in the decisive battle of the Revolutionary War at Yorktown, the one that brought the U.S. its freedom. All this despite whatever feelings may have been generated that winter in Lebanon. That wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Dr. Robert Selig, Chief Consultant to the National Park Service on the Rochambeau Trail, and also the author of the book, Hussars in Lebanon. The answer to this week's trivia question: what major event happened in Waterbury in early February 1902? Well, it was a massive fire that destroyed much of the downtown. And next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to have version number 2 of Trivia Tidbits, and we're going to have 7 stories of destructive fires and train accidents from throughout Connecticut from the 1800s and 1900s, some of which you likely have never heard about before. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.